Yep, you're live.
All right. Welcome to the Bridge webinar series, a monthly webinar hosted by the Masters of Educational Technology program at Michigan State University. My name is Michelle Shira Hegerman, and here in the Masters of Ed Tech program, I lead the graduate certificate programs in educational technology and online teaching and learning, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. A little bit about the Bridge. Our goal for the program has always been to bring together informed perspectives on a range of issues in educational technology that impact teacher practice. As always, we invite comments via Twitter and on our website. On Twitter, we use the hashtag MAET all one word, and you can also contribute to the conversation on the embedded Etherpad at bridge.educ.msu.edu. And episodes are always archived there too. I am really excited about today's conversation because we're focusing on recent interdisciplinary research that can inform teachers' practice. I am joined by 5 colleagues who presented their research actually at the annual meeting of the Society for Information Technology and Teacher Education, or SITE, in Las Vegas earlier this month. Brian Arnold, Liz Boltz, Lee Graves-Wolf, Aman Yadav, and Rohit Mehta, thank you so much for joining us on the Bridge today. Let's start with some introductions. Maybe you could tell us a bit about who you are, what you do, and to start off, just give us a one-line sentence about your research and your research interests, and then what we'll do is come back to really focus on each of your studies. Brian, would you like to start us off?
Sure, thanks, Michelle. My name is Brian Arnold. I am at the end of my first year of the EPET program, Educational Psychology and Educational Technology at MSU. In my real life, so to speak, I am an assistant professor and lead faculty for an undergraduate digital media design program. And my research interests are, and I'm still honing in on this, are the ways in which we can use media engagement tools to stimulate situational interest.
Thank you. Liz, how about you?
Hi, my name is Liz Boltz, and I'm a second-year EPET student at MSU. And my research interests focus on learning with games, especially learning in complex and ill-structured domains. And that is my real life, so to speak, at this point.
Thanks so much, Liz. Welcome again. Lee, how about you? Welcome.
Thank you. My name is Lee Graves-Wolf. I'm an associate professor in the Educational Psychology and Educational Technology program and co-direct the Master of Arts in Educational Technology program. And my research interests broadly are in teacher professional development in all different types of contexts. Specifically, what I'll be talking about today are 2 projects, one in online learning and one in an urban context.
Thank you. Aman, how about you? Welcome.
Thank you. Da-da-da, da-da-da, on ESPN, right?
Yeah, exactly.
My name is Aman Yadav. I'm a faculty in the Educational Psychology and Educational Technology program here at MSU. I also teach in the Masters in Ed Tech program, taught overseas, and I'm teaching currently in online for the MAET program. My work focuses on preparing teachers to embed computational thinking practices in their classroom, as well as developing online professional development for teachers to prepare them to teach computer science at the high school level.
Thanks. Welcome again. And Rohit.
Hi, thank you. Like Liz, I am also a second-year doctoral student in the EPET program, Education Psychology and Education Technology here at MSU. And my research interests are in visual and media literacy. I'm looking at the process of reading in multimodal environments, and I'm recently starting to develop some interest in scientific literacy as well. And that's what I'm going to talk about with you today. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, as you can see, we've got a really interesting and interdisciplinary panel of expert thinkers and researchers today. I'd like to go back to Brian and Liz, your work that you presented at the SITE conference. Your paper called Players, Features, and Enjoyment. I'm really interested to hear a little bit about that work. why you chose the research topic. Tell us a little bit about the focus and what you found.
Liz, you want to take it?
Sure. So we both have an interest in games and learning with games, and one of the things that is a pretty big topic of conversation in that field is just this disconnect between educational games, which are kind of notoriously unfun. There's the idea of chocolate-covered broccoli that's tossed around, that we're basically just kind of putting a layer of a game over something that is really still not very fun, and that students often can detect that relatively quickly. And then comparing that to entertainment games, which are so fun, they can be criticized for being addictive. So we wanted to investigate that a little bit and look into what features of entertainment games make them fun, and what might we learn from that and take those possibly to apply to educational contexts. So the reason that we went the route that we did is to look at reviews from people who play games and what players say about those games. So there's been a lot of studies done in terms of what do experts say, what do game developers say, but we were really interested in looking at what do people who play games say about games that makes them enjoyable. So, you know, Brian, if you wanted to add anything that I missed.
I did, but you hit all the good points. So
Oh.
that's exactly what we were doing. Is just trying to reconcile. Michelle mentioned that sort of practitioner focus is, you know, when educators want to choose an educational game, we were hoping to give them some language that will help them make a more accurate decision as to what the actual players are looking for when considering a game.
Okay, so on that point about language, what were players saying, and what words, language, ideas did you identify as being transcendent, perhaps, to that classroom context, or that could really help teachers to make good choices about the games they pick?
I'll go ahead and jump in. So we used a taxonomy, I think it was Bedwell's taxonomy of 9 categories to analyze the games. And so the ones that were triggered most frequently by the 200 reviews that we coded, and all 3 of us coded all 200 reviews, was conflict and challenge. Was by far the most important element of gaming for gamers. I might be jumping into a future question, but my background is in storytelling, is in narrative and writing and all this stuff. And so that was actually a little further down the list. So immersion was I believe the second one. Liz, do you remember what the third one was?
Control.
Control, okay. So immersion is the sense of being involved in the story and involved in the environment. Mm-hmm. And control was the player's sense of agency. So you're playing a game and you need to break a window and you see a hammer and you go to reach for the hammer and you can't grab it, right? So that your control is blocked, your agency is thwarted. So players want a robust sense of control within the game. So again, to review, conflict challenge was the big one, immersion was the second, and control was the third most mentioned value or source of enjoyment in a game.
Okay, so those are the things that gamers seem to report as being important. How does that apply to the classroom now?
I think one of the conclusions that we drew from that is that it does appear that there are certain features of games that may be more important in terms of making them enjoyable. And we all sort of related that sense of enjoyment to engagement in the classroom, which is usually one of the main reasons that teachers want to employ games in the classroom, is they know that games can be really engaging. So if their goal is to choose games that are engaging, they might want to, when selecting or even developing a game, because there are some teachers who kind of work on developing their own, when they're doing that, they may want to place more of a priority on the development of these features versus other ones.
So, for example, one of our findings was story is very important to players, and I know I love story. A lot of times games get lost in their story without addressing these core mechanics that lead to enjoyment we just talked about, conflict, challenge. So if it's not a challenging game but it's a neat story, you tend to lose the player. So a lot of instructors who want to design their own games, oh, I got this really cool Kirby the astronaut, kids like astronauts, I'm going to tell this really great story about Kirby, and they've missed the mark. So that's the intention of us finding these taxonomy categories that most relate to what players are looking for when they play.
Yeah, and I think exactly what Brian is getting at is just this idea that I think in our paper we mentioned, if you've got a game and it's really not a good game, the sense of conflict and challenge isn't there, but then you sugarcoat it with a great story, that's not going to be enough. So that's one takeaway that we pulled from this.
Can I jump in with a quick question just to get
Sure.
the landscape of what you were studying? So you said there were 200 reviews that you looked over. Was that for 200 games, or what was kind of the scope and the genre of the games that you looked at?
So I'll jump in. We coded 200 games that were reviews on videogamegeek.com, which is a fairly well-reputed game site. We chose 10 reviews. It gets a little complicated. From the top 10 rated games on the site, and 10 reviews from each of the bottom 10 rated games on the site. So 10 times 10, 100 at the top, 10 times 10, 100 at the bottom. That was our 200 reviews.
Cool, thanks.
And I also want to mention Spencer Greenhall was our third partner and a very key team member on this study. And he's not with us today, but he played a huge role in making this study happen. So thank you, Spencer, out there in cyberspace.
He might be on the live stream. Who knows?
Maybe. I think he's outside the door. I'll yell at him.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Okay, so I just want to ask you another question about sort of the implications for classrooms. So we know what matters in terms of engagement. How do you sort of, if I'm a classroom teacher, I'm thinking about what my kids are learning, right? So the reason that I would introduce a game would be to introduce an environment that would ultimately support their learning. Mm-hmm. So what is the research that would suggest that engagement leads to learning? Because I feel like there's this assumption, right? If kids are having fun, they're learning things. Mm-hmm. But what is the research there that teachers can stand on to make that justification to themselves, even as the professional?
Liz, can I give a soft answer and then you can back me up with something more meaningful? So
go for it.
Yeah, the idea is that if learners aren't engaged, they're not paying attention. There's no opportunity for learning. So we're creating opportunities for learning by heightening engagement. We're not saying if you engage them 20% more, you'll get a 10% return on learning. We're simply saying we know if they're not paying attention, they're definitely not learning. Shoot, there's another part to your question. Liz, I'm going to turn it back to you and then follow up when I remember what I wanted to say.
Sure. Well, mine might be a soft answer also, but I think Brian hit the nail on the head there. That was our goal with the study, was to kind of address that aspect, because while I would venture to say that the jury is still out on a lot of the other outcomes from games in the classroom and games for learning, engagement seems to be the one that there is general agreement on. But I think, Michelle, you're absolutely right. We do need more than that, and those are definitely important areas of research. My own personal opinion, and this isn't really related to the work that we've done, but is that games really don't work as well as a means of content delivery, but they are systems and designed experiences that can really support learning and support discovery, informal learning opportunities, preparation for future learning. My feeling is that's where a lot of the potential lies in games, but I think there's a lot of research yet to be done, which is surprising, right? Because video games are really not that new. I mean, I've been playing games ever since Oregon Trail, the old version, which was a black screen with green, the old version. So, but there's still a lot of work to be done. So, Brian, did you want to?
I do remember now.
Okay.
First of all, the overarching theme, which is with any ed tech implementation, you have to choose the exact right tool for the problem. It's one tool among many. It's not, slap some game on there and everything will be better. You still have to choose the right one. Like you said, Michelle, it has to fit the problem or the lesson or the content. It can't just be a really good game. Secondarily, one of our premises in the paper is that there are good educational games. What we're looking for is a language for them to help communicate it to the teachers and the learners so that they have a common understanding. If you say, oh, this game is fun, well, that means 100 things to 100 people. So we're trying to find that place where you can say, it's got this conflict challenge, and oh, okay, well, and then it also matches the content of my lesson. It's just another criteria for better communication between the developer and the user.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and I think that to the extent that our research broadly, right, can support those kinds of discussions, more sophisticated discussions with common language that means certain things, right? I mean, that's really moving the field forward. So you talked about directions for future. Where do you go from here? What are the questions that remain to be answered based on the work that you've already done?
Well, I think, and I'll let Brian answer this as well, but one of the things that I would like to do eventually is expand this to other data sets. We looked at, as Brian mentioned, videogamegeek.com, which is a game review site, has some really valuable data, but I think it'd be interesting to expand that and look at other game review sites, perhaps more, perhaps larger, more diverse sites, because I think it's really important that we capture that we test this taxonomy and capture the language used by players in the most diverse way possible, because different players come to games with different sets of values, different things that they find enjoyable. And to kind of jump back to something Brian mentioned earlier about what surprised us or what maybe we thought was interesting, both Brian and I are really into narrative and story and game fiction, but yet game fiction didn't really rate that highly as something that contributed to enjoyment, which we both found sort of like, oh.
But maybe your point about different gamers, right, are interested in different things, right?
Right.
And
exactly.
it could be young men, young women might have different interests. Absolutely.
Absolutely, and one of the things about this game review site that we used is it's kind of a companion site to BoardGameGeek.com, which is another fantastic site that's even bigger, that has a whole bunch of reviews and information about board games, which is fantastic. But one possible limitation of the study is that board game audiences tend to put a lot of weight on mechanics, possibly more so than video game players. So depending on how much crossover audience there is to that review site, that may have played a role in why some of these things rated so highly. So I think it's important for establishing generalizability that we kind of look beyond that source and find some other game review sites to investigate.
So for future directions, how about not only looking at kids playing games, but also developing games, right? So it's a lot more easier to think about using Game Star City or scalable game design or Scratch even, right, as a potential tool to allow kids to develop games. Have you guys thought about going in that direction as well?
I think that's a really fascinating and cool aspect of this field. I don't think, Brian, that we've really talked about taking this study in that direction.
Not yet. It's definitely an option down the road.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The other piece I wanted to add is having, because I know who the audience is here, having presented, seeing other collaborators with similar interests and possibly, joining forces with them and talking to them. So.
And one other thing, just to mention, that just briefly, two of the things that we found that weren't really addressed by the taxonomy, I think Brian and I found really interesting too, and those were the ideas of a return on investment with games, like what kind of value for the time and investment of money that players get, and also predisposition, so what might predispose a player to enjoy a game. And those are kind of interesting things that we would want to test in future research just to see if those two criteria kind of hold up.
Thanks. So I want to apologize. We had a little bit of a technical glitch over here in my office. We lost Wi-Fi.
Oh no!
But the conversation kept going. So I do apologize. Rohit and I are in the same room, and fortunately, and we both lost Wi-Fi at the same time. And anyway, it was kind of crazy. So I do apologize for that little diversion. So
you
thank
asked a good question, so we just kept going.
Great, that's fantastic. And I'll watch the archive to hear what you actually said. I apologize for that part. What I'd like to do is to maybe transition to talk about another project. This is so exciting. Thank you so much for sharing this work. I'm really enjoyed it, listening to you talk about it. But let's transition now to talk about the work that Lee presented. She actually talked on a couple of projects, and I know she's going to review a couple of those now.
Thanks, Michelle.
You're welcome.
The first project, we presented a 2-hour symposium on the MSU Urban STEM project that we have, which is funded by Wipro. And it was a tremendous opportunity for us a year out of the grant beginning to get together, take a look at what we've done, share some preliminary results of our research, our methods for teaching. It was a tremendous opportunity to do that and to get some feedback from the audience as well. I'm not going to go too into depth into that project because I believe the next Bridge webinar is entirely devoted to that project, so there's a little teaser for next month. But if anyone wants to find out more, the website is msuurbanstem.org, and that contains all of our materials for the project there. But the second project is spearheaded by Ann Hines, jointly with Michelle and myself, and it's a study that spurred from our work in CEP 820, which is teaching online. That course has been running for quite a few years now, and we have a lot of phenomenal teachers, K-12 teachers, who have been creating online and hybrid learning spaces. So there's a tremendous opportunity that we saw to study those teachers. So one of the first inroads into the data has come out in the site presentation, and we studied and interviewed 7, I believe it was, teachers, 6 who made it into the final study, from across the K-12 spectrum who have created online spaces. And it's absolutely fascinating to hear how the students not only have designed those spaces, but the focus of this study was teacher persona and how they present themselves online, how they conceptualize themselves, and how that comes out in the work that they do online and offline. And it was a tremendous opportunity at site to share some of our in-process research and to talk with other people as well. And one of the things, and then Michelle, I'll let you jump in, one of the things that surprised me or stuck out to me in particular was not necessarily in the research itself, but in that word online. It's a very messy term, I've found. And what does that actually mean? Does online mean hybrid? When you say online, I think there's a mental model that each of us pull up that's completely different. So from a research standpoint, that was important for me as a takeaway to articulate more clearly what that means to us as researchers and what that means to me. And it's such an emerging area, and there are so many, as Michelle and I have seen, and Aman or any of us that have taught in the online spaces, so many different versions of that. And I think what we see in MAET is a quite unique version, because a lot of online teachers are working in spaces that have been designed for them. So we have a unique opportunity in the research we're doing on this project to look at teacher-designed spaces as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if I can just jump in, I would say too that when we think about K-12 teachers using online elements in their work, we really did find a broad range of experience. And their introduction, for the most part, to teaching online was through this course. But then the people we interviewed went on to integrate online elements into their courses, not necessarily following in that traditional flipped model that you hear so much about, but many of them found that their face-to-face instruction could be supported or enhanced by the addition of online elements. And what was fascinating to us was how each of the interviewees really prioritized or emphasized the communication of self, right, and that the relationship building that they maybe were working to do in their face-to-face classroom absolutely had to continue in that online space, and that they could use that online space to communicate, both who they were and the students knew, right, could predict and feel connected to the teacher in that way, but also highlight different aspects or kind of funny or humoristic aspects of their personalities that wouldn't necessarily have a space, right, in their face-to-face instruction. So for instance, there was this one teacher who recorded herself using kind of like this robot voice that she wouldn't necessarily have used in her face-to-face instruction. But, when creating that video to communicate content to her students, she knew that that would be a humorous or sort of engaging way. So getting back to that idea of engagement, right, that Brian and Liz were talking about, again, in that online space, it's not a game situation, but it seems that these teachers really did understand the importance of using the relationship building aspect of their teaching in creating those online artifacts, maybe, or learning experiences in their courses. So that was pretty exciting and interesting to see come out of our data. Lee, did you have anything else to add?
Gosh, I'm trying to think of other things. It's just really exciting to get that work out and share it. I think it has motivated me especially to get back out and dig more, and just that importance too. We take so much for granted when we're speaking and assumptions, and how important that is in scholarly, not just scholarly communications, but any sort of communications that we do, to really articulate our points of view. And that sort of came to fruition in sitting in the table with everyone else, especially in online, because I think that what our MAET students do is quite unique in that respect. Not better or worse, but unique. And so helping our students, one takeaway I had just professionally was helping our students articulate better the work that they're doing in the program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there was a sense of empowerment, too, that came, right? A sense of agency. I mean, getting back again to these ideas that Liz and Brian also talked about, how powerful for a couple of our teachers it felt to be able to construct these learning environments in digital contexts was very empowering for them. We've certainly heard from many of our students that their agency, right, is thwarted in different ways. That's maybe another whole bridge episode. But to feel control and to feel creative and to feel that you're actively constructing something that your students will use and that comes from you and your understanding of this space, the online space that is, was seemingly very empowering for our students as well.
I think so, and there's so many challenges. I mean, these were very authentic contexts that our students were working within, and the challenges, like you said, that we could spend a whole episode speaking of, but to have these cases as examples for others to empower them to show that something can be done despite many different forces seemingly working against you.
Yeah, exactly. And so in terms of where we're going next with this project, we are working to publish this over the summer. Hopefully we'll get it out.
I hope so, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so that can be accessed more broadly by the MAET community, but of course by everyone.
Yeah.
Any last words?
I don't think so.
Okay, great. Well, Aman, let's go to you then. Please share a little bit about the work you presented at SITE.
Okay. So I've been working in the computational thinking, computer science education space for the last 4 or 5 years, with support from external funding from National Science Foundation. And so I presented a work on a course that I taught last semester for MAET, computational thinking and problem solving. Just to give you a little background, computational thinking is basically how we use computer science ideas in our lives without even knowing that we're using computer science ideas. So for example, algorithm. Every time some teachers or students hear algorithms, they think, "Oh, that's math. I don't do math, right? Or I'm not good at math," which is another discussion to have about adults saying that I'm not good at math. But we use algorithms, when we follow a recipe. That's an algorithm. When we give directions to somebody to go from point A to point B, that's an algorithm. So it's the idea that making kids and teachers comfortable with these computer science ideas that we already use in our lives, and how can we embed them in our curriculum. So I presented, examples that we have in our lives where computer science that draw from computer science, as well as computer science draws on ideas from our lives. So we talked about abstraction. So how do you generalize ideas from solving one problem and apply it to other problems, and automation, right? So that's where the programming aspect of computer science comes into place. And then I shared some findings of results that I have from a study with teachers. So initially, when teachers don't know about computational thinking, they think, oh, it's more computer literacy, right? Rather than these computational thinking ideas that I just mentioned. But once you talk about computational thinking ideas and how to integrate computational thinking ideas in the classroom, they become more familiar with that. It is a problem-solving approach that uses algorithms where you take a problem and decompose it, right? So problem decomposition becomes a part of that. And then, talking about what are some examples of CT in K-12, right? So in elementary education, breaking down a simple daily task of brushing teeth into 15 separate and distinct steps, right? To talk about algorithms, English, so our pattern recognition, so identifying similarities between rap and poetry, and matching rappers with poets based on similar styles or characteristics, right? So that's how you can do CT in an English classroom. Similarly, history, right? Studying historical events and statistical data to investigate, what causes immigration rates to change over time, right? So that's, pattern recognition is a big part of computational thinking. So I shared some of that work on CT that I've been engaged in the last 4 or 5 years, and for MAET students that want to take a course, and so that's a preview of put a plug for the computational thinking and problem solving course that I'll be teaching again in the fall. So if anyone wants to take it, we'd love to have you in the course as well. So
thanks, Aman. So my question for you is, how do you see, do you have an example, maybe something that you presented at the conference, of a teacher? I mean, you gave sort of examples of how it could happen, but do you have an actual example of a teacher that you've worked with whose practice has been sort of transformed by these ideas?
So so during the summer when I taught overseas, we used computational thinking. We embedded these ideas in the classroom, and one of the teachers talked about how it is hard for students to grasp the idea when you teach an English literature class. The time scale, right?
Yeah.
That it's hard for them. It does 1300 to 1400 doesn't mean anything for them, right? So she used, so we were talking about pattern recognition and data representation. So she created, as a part of the course, she created this timeline, right, that started with the 1300s and to the present time, and showcase, what happened in the 1300s, and how sliver of their lives is on this timeline, right? So to showcase the idea of that, all these historical events that have happened. So Romeo and Juliet was first published in 1597, right, or whatever the year was. It doesn't mean much to students, right? So if you put it on that time, if you represent that on a timeline and all the events that have happened in literature across, from 1500s to now, and her students are just a sliver of that timeline. So, that's one example of how she used data representation, the idea of computational thinking, to showcase that. But a lot of times people talk about, when they think of computational thinking, they think of programming. I don't necessarily see it as, programming is a part of computational thinking, but you could do computational thinking and embed these ideas, like the example that I gave of, creating a timeline in the course. So, like, I was talking to another teacher at a school district in Colorado, and the analogy we used was, everybody needs to learn how to drive, but not everybody is going to be a race car driver. So the same idea, everybody needs to, be comfortable or understand these concepts from computer science, but not everybody is going to go and become a programmer, right?
Right.
So the same idea, that these ideas apply whether you want to be an economist or a physicist, that is using these ideas to solve problems in those specific discipline, not necessarily become a computer scientist.
Right, right. So one of the, as you know, one of the big driving forces right now in education, in the U.S. anyway, is the Common Core State Standards, right? And there is a huge focus on sort of disciplinary ways of thinking, disciplinary ways of understanding, literacy or literature or genre or, well, just think about it in terms of, the way scientists think, the way historians think, the way that literary critics, right, might think about literature. So when you describe the disciplinary thinking, right, of a computational thinker, Aman, what are sort of what are the words that teachers could take away? So, I mean, you've said them, but I'm just trying to frame it sort of around that curriculum so that teachers can sort of say, oh yeah, I see that in my discipline, right?
Yeah. So, so for example, problem decomposition is a big part of computational thinking. So how do you take a more complex problem and break it down into more knowable parts?
Right. And that's a part of every discipline, right?
And that's a part of every discipline, right? So how do you, for example, in English, how do you take a sentence and break it down in different structures of that? Right. So that's I would say that's a computational thinking, right? I gave an example of data representation, right? So I think that's big in every discipline. Like, how do you represent poetry, right? How is that represented, right? How does it flow, so to speak, and same like in you could take data in geography or history or science, how do you collect that data, how do you analyze, and finally how do you represent that data to make it accessible to, how do you communicate and make it accessible to others, right? So I think that's key to every discipline, and so that's a computational thinking practice.
Right. And so these are ways too, I mean, if I can just, maybe this is a naive connection, but it seems to be kind of obvious to me, right? I mean, by using these words, this language, and by thinking about our disciplines in this way, we can very quickly see how every teacher becomes a teacher of like STEM concepts, basically.
Yeah. And I think recently there's been a lot of focus on STEM, but I think to have a well-rounded education, it's key to be able to talk about these concepts within those disciplines, rather than, everybody's not going to be a computer scientist, as I said earlier, right? But those ideas apply to every discipline. Yeah, so I'd agree, yeah, absolutely.
Right, exactly. And I mean, if broadly our goal, right, as educators is to get kids to be thinking in more sophisticated ways about all sorts of problems, then having the kind of vocabulary that you've introduced, right, kind of moves us all in a common direction, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If I could jump in, Aman, you mentioned the data representation. I think that's sort of a universal piece for educators as well, because you're giving visual context to isolated facts. And the context is what allows it to have meaning for the student. So it seems like a very clear tool that nearly any discipline could take advantage of.
Yeah. So I mean, I mean, it's for everyone. It's for everywhere, right? It's an important skill for everybody to learn.
Thank you so much. I'm just looking at the time, and we have another colleague here sitting beside me, Rohit, who also presented his work at site. And Rohit, I'd love to give you some time to talk about your work.
Thank you. So I won't take long, but it's interesting how I was just thinking when Liz and Brian were talking, and Lee mentioned her research, and when Aman was just talking about genre and how we can break it down. I can connect to almost everything here, and mainly the idea of engagement, because the study that I'm going to talk about is it's also driven by the same idea of engagement. We're talking about how science has been conceived as something that is a dull subject for students in classrooms, but not just limiting ourselves to classrooms and not just thinking about why science is dull, but also talking about the public perception of science. We see that science is rife with misconceptions when it comes to public in general, and examples are all over with anti-vaccines and climate change and all the topics. So we were looking at, like, what is it about science that does not make it compelling or exciting enough for students or public in general, especially when they move away from schools and move away from science. So what can be done, or what is it about science that is compelling for scientists? Like, why do they like science? So we tried to look at research that talked about things that scientists found compelling about science, and we looked at Mark Girard's work, who was a MSU grad, EPET grad as well, and he talked about the idea of beauty in science, like the aesthetics in science. And he studied a bunch of articles and literature where scientists talked about their work, and mathematicians and physicists talked about their work. And he came up with these 4 broad categories of beauty in science. So we took that idea, and what we did was we tried to look for a source of scientific knowledge for general public and see if these ideas of beauty in science are actually conveyed in this popular source as well. So we looked at Cosmos because of its popularity and also its credibility, given the creators and the hosts of the show. It is based on the original show by Carl Sagan, who is arguably the most popular astrobiologist ever, and then followed by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's also a reputed astrophysicist. So given the credibility and popularity of the show, we tried to code the show, all the 13 episodes, and look for the idea of, like, how are they making their show compelling and exciting for the viewers. So are these 4 themes that Mark Girard found that scientists find compelling about science, do they also appear in this show? And we did not limit ourselves to these 4 themes. We also tried to look for other emerging themes. And we found that the theme that dominated the show, which comes from Girard's idea as well, is the idea of the sublime in science, the idea of awe-inspiring and wonder. And the show was rife with the idea of beauty and sublime. Other themes that we saw were the beauty in the representation of idea, or the intellectual beauty. That the idea in itself is so beautiful. And the best example would be the theory of relativity. When you represent it, the representation itself is so beautiful that is something that makes it compelling and exciting to just work with that. And that is a good segue into the 3rd theme, that was the idea of the aesthetic experience. When you're working in something, that experience in itself is aesthetic. But the idea that emerged, the theme that we found emerging, was the idea of representing scientists as heroes, as adventurers, as explorers. This was one theme that was dominant in this show, and the discourse kept referring to scientists as if they were adventurers and explorers and detectives. Like, they were on their journey to solve mysteries and which made it so compelling for viewers. And this is something that we could take, the ideas that we could take and bring those to classrooms. So to wrap it up, I got this opportunity to talk about this research with teachers in the North Branch area here in Michigan, and talk to them about how these ideas could be used in science-based topics and other classrooms, and bringing back the aesthetics to disciplines like science and even mathematics and history and all the other disciplines as well.
That's so cool. I'm just going to do a little sound check. Can everybody still hear us?
Just move it back towards you, then it was fine.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, just move it a little bit towards you, and then it's perfect.
Okay, the only trouble is that our video has again frozen, so I just wanted to be sure that you could still hear us, even though we feel that we're kind of frozen in a moment inside of my office.
Right.
So one of the questions, Rohit, that I would like to ask you that everybody's kind of addressed is, was there anything surprising about that data set that you came across? I mean, those codes are fascinating to me, but was there something that emerged that you were like, wow, this is very surprising, and why?
So when we began with Gerard's themes, we anticipated that these themes would emerge.
Right.
But what we didn't expect was the Sublime as a theme to dominate the entire discourse that well.
Okay.
So the idea of wonder, and one example would be the idea of capturing the entire span of the universe on a time scale that is more perceivable, and the time scale of a calendar year. So January 1st being the birth of the universe, the Big Bang, and December end being right now, and on that scale, the entire human race has evolved only on last like couple of 6 seconds or so.
Yeah.
And that is so grand and so hard to perceive, which in itself is the beauty in Sublime.
Right.
And that was one thing that kind of surprised us.
Right.
But the second idea of the scientists being detectives and adventurers, that was so amazing, and it made so much sense that, you know what, like kids love that kind of stuff, like being detectives and being adventurous, and you're solving mysteries. So that was another great idea that we loved.
So what you just said, I mean, reminded me of what Brian and Liz were talking about earlier, right? I mean, you were talking about challenge and conflict and engagement being integral, right, in a digital gaming space. And it makes me wonder about, right, the sort of underlying fascination, right, for scientists to commit their whole lives to the struggle, essentially, right, of answering very difficult questions, right? I wonder if there is something analogous going on, right, in the way that scientists are talking about their work, or the way that it's been described on the show.
Right.
And maybe what Liz and Brian were seeing in their own data, right, with gamers essentially engaged. What do you think? Am I
There's a
on top of my
conflict.
head there, or do you think there's something to it?
I think there's a conflict challenge large enough to be worthy of them dedicating their lives to as scientists. It's a game worth playing. Solving it is that interesting.
Yeah, that's really well said, Brian.
And Rohit also brought up that time scale map, which speaks directly to Aman's point about data representation. That was a way to get your mind around this vast concept. So.
Yeah, and also how what I think Lee and Michelle were talking about, how Michelle was talking to Aman about this, and how writers, what do they find compelling about literature? What do scientists like about science? And these are the ideas that we already know that these things are working. Like these people love their work. Like Richard Feynman used to literally play with his work, and so what is it that he likes? And let's bring that to the classrooms. Let's use that. Let's use what's already working.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fantastic. So I'm just looking at the time, and we've only got a few minutes left in our
Time for the bridge. And one of the questions that we ask everyone, and it's connected to what Rohit just said actually, is what do you love about the work that you do? And I think that's going to be a really good place for us to end our conversation today. Brian, maybe you'd like to answer that question first.
In terms of the research we just did, it's a personal lifetime passion of mine, gaming. I've seen it evolve. I've seen its power. I've experienced its power personally to engage both in unhealthy and healthy ways. And it just seems like a tool that could really make what is sometimes a very unpleasant process of learning a lot more enjoyable.
Thank you. Liz, what about you? What do you love about the work that you do?
Well, I think it's something that it's the thread that connects everything we've discussed today, and it's the idea that it really is bigger than just video games.
Mm-hmm.
It transcends one medium, and it's really about how do we create playful learning? How do we make learning playful? Whether that's a board game, whether that's a video game, when we invest someone who's playing a game with a sense that they're kind of situated as the hero, like the Carl Sagan of the game, that has a power to it. So how do we harness that without trying to necessarily force it to be a closed content delivery system? How do we integrate that into a larger approach to make learning playful?
Thank you. Lee, what about you? What do you love?
Well, I think back to the MSU motto of advancing knowledge and transforming lives, and we're talking and we're doing this research, and then Rohit mentioned he just went to North Branch to talk with teachers, and this direct connection that we have with teachers and classrooms to the work that we're doing is just phenomenal, and is what keeps me excited and engaged, and I think it's a tremendous opportunity, unique opportunity we have here in our program.
Thanks. Ahmad?
Just to build off what Lee said, I think, a big key at MSU is engaged scholarship, right? So for me, that the work we're doing, research, teaching, makes a difference in the classroom, and you hear it constantly from the alumni of the MAET program, how much of a difference we're making, and it's always good to hear that, as a positive reinforcement for us. So for me, thinking about, I started my life as a programmer, and now on the flip side, coming full circle and thinking about, how do you embed these ideas in the classroom, so that's exciting for me.
Fantastic. Rohit, last word.
Yeah, it's kind of similar to what you just said. Like the real-time implications of what you're doing, and you can just go and talk to teachers about it and see if they like it, if it works. And the other way too, like you see what's going on in the world, and then see that I don't agree with that. I want to do something about that. And that real-time interaction, that is something that I have never done before, and I just totally love it.
Yeah. It's really exciting. Well, I think the world, is pretty lucky to have all of you making your contributions to it and to supporting teachers with your passions and your own engagement with these really hard questions. Thank you so much to each of you for joining us today on The Bridge. As I said before, the archive will be available at bridge.educ.msu.edu. In a little while, once we get it up there, and we thank you all for lending your informed perspectives to the conversation today. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Good night. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, great.